I mean, tell me something else. But you don't know what your response is going to be until you're in the present, so to speak, right? And I had no questions. I went to Utah and I started with the idea of blue as the central angle, and then I built a green and a yellow, different sides, 3 sides. The dance was, the way we worked at that time was to rehearse very heavily. A stopwatch was always used in the timing of the movement. We would mark the places of the camera, mark the places of the dancers, and rehearse, and look for mistakes or pitfalls. And we would spend most of the day rehearsing and shoot very little. But when we would shoot, it would be with the purpose of getting, at this time, I think, our maximum per day screen time was about 3 minutes, working 8 to 10 hours. And that was a lot, having been increased from maybe 2.5 minutes a couple of years before that on a work called Points in Space that we made in London. One aspect I'd just like to point out while I heard it was that the recording of the breaths and footfalls that the dancers made were very important elements to me in the making of the work, because I believe it gives the viewer choreographic information to better interpret and understand what's happening in the dancing. So in a group scene, if someone puts their foot down in the back, you need to hear that sound so that you know that that foot went down. Now, of course, the camera is designed in such a way so that you also see that person. Always when the camera moves, if someone is blocking someone else, it's usually only momentary, because the ideal is to be able to see the dance, to make it clear, and to hopefully make an experience for the screen that's interesting. In the next excerpt I want to show you, which is from Beach Birds for Camera, that project began in a very strange way, because Merce had talked to me about wanting to begin a new film, but with a different dance. And I had seen the piece in a stage version, and I thought its design would be too complex for the camera, between the costume and the background. So I said to him, thinking about black and white film, I said, why don't we do something in black and white? And I told him I thought the design was too complex. And he said, well, I have this new dance that I'm beginning called Beach Birds, and maybe you should come and see that. It has black and white costumes. Marcia Skinner, the woman who designed the costumes for Beach Birds, had seen the video Changing Steps. And she liked the black and white costumes so much that she used that idea in Beach Birds, but extended the hands beautifully so that the arms of the dancers would connect to the idea of birds. So everything kind of came full circle. And in the shooting for Beach Birds, at one point, we had been rehearsing in the studio at Westbeth. And I knew that for the beginning of the film, I wanted to use a series of close-ups of the hands. But we never rehearsed that part because I had a very clear idea about what I wanted to do. So it wasn't incorporated in the rehearsal. Once we got to the set, and we were actually shooting the film. I had to shoot, obviously, the beginning of the film. So I took the time in the schedule to do that. We then went to the next scene. It was a very difficult scene, and it basically wasn't working on camera as we had rehearsed it in the studio. Merce and I would sit at a table together in front of a monitor, which would feature the output from the camera so that we can both see it in rehearsal. We would talk. And I told him that I didn't think the scene was working. And he would try something else in the choreography, and it wasn't working, and try something else, it wasn't working. So as our day elapsed, he turned to me and he said, "Is it working now?" I said, "No." He took his papers. He threw them on the desk. He got up from the table and turned to me and said, "If you hadn't been working on this foolish beginning, we would have gotten this scene." And he left the room. This was the only time in 20 years that he lost his temper with me. And I was stunned. I, of course, knew I had to come up with something because I sensed he was at the end of what was possible for him. I went to the dancers. We were now facing our last day. We had to make up that scene and do an entire day shooting. And then everyone was leaving for Christmas break. I asked the dancers to come in early the final day. They agreed. I asked the crew. They agreed. I stayed that night with the cameraman and a couple of production people, and I reworked the scene so that we can get that scene and the final day shooting. Merce came in the next morning. He said good morning. He never mentioned anything from the previous day. We sat down to work, and we shot the following scene. Okay, thank you. My experience in working in film, not just with Merce, but with other choreographers, both in the United States and in Europe, was that there was never enough time, never enough money, and usually the space wasn't big enough. And if I started with that and just kept that in mind, usually I found a way to work out most problems that would come along, and problems would come along. It's not easy to collaborate, but when you work with someone, in this case like Cunningham, it's like working with a professional tennis player who's very good, and even if you're not so good at tennis, your game improves because you're working with someone who's good. I felt that. But I spent, as I said before, many years watching this work unfold. And I tried to find a way to record it as much as I could and to preserve the work that had come before. And in a way, the making of Cage Cunningham gave me that excuse, so that as I raised money for the film, or as money came in for the film, I would not just preserve a scene from an archival work, but I would preserve the whole film. And we were able to build a collection of tapes and 16mm prints that had been sitting next to heaters and file cabinets up on the 11th floor in Merce's back office. So it was very valuable from that point of view. But for the most part, when I would move around with a camera or just go into a room where they were working or rehearsing or speaking, I felt as though, to some extent, I was pushing that envelope to the limit that I could. And because I had this access to them, the kind of material that I looked for was not material that would be featured in a book or in other films that I had seen. But I tried to find a way to go through a back door to show simple daily events like Cunningham warming up, which he had done and continues to do every day of his life, but featuring an activity that usually no one has seen, except the dancers, because at some point they arrive on stage with him. So I'd come in the room with the camera, and Merce would look up, or John would look up and say something like, "Oh, it's only Eliot." And then they would go back to whatever they were doing. And I would sit and wait. And I had this system that I was working with, because I couldn't involve other people. I'm not sure I would have gotten the moment, so to speak, where I wore a tape recorder around my neck with a crystal sync unit on it that allowed the picture and the sound to come together. I had a camera on my shoulder, a tool belt with extra lenses and light meters, a backpack with extra magazines, and I carried the tripod under this arm. And I knew, for those of you who shoot in film, you know that if your eye isn't on the eyepiece of the camera, you are possibly exposing film, so you have to close the eyepiece. And I found that from closing the eyepiece, not looking in the camera, and knowing the range of my lenses, I could sit, not lose eye contact with my subject, turn the camera on, turn the tape recorder on, snap once in front of the lens for a head slate, or sometimes record the scene and then snap twice for a tail slate, and get a kind of material that to me was fresh, not planned, no stress for the subject. Next clip. This is a scene from such a scene. Okay.
Well, Choppy Gardens.
It was about 35 degrees on that stage, which was in South Korea, as the title said. And that moment came after I had put the camera equipment away. It was the end of the day. And in my, I had remembered something that a filmmaker teacher, Bruce Bailey, had taught me, that sometimes the moment comes when you put the camera equipment away and you're exhausted and you have to, do you take it out or don't you? And everyone had left the theater. Merce decided to return and just rework his solo for that evening's performance one more time. That was that. The next scene is from the last film that I made with Cunningham, and was the first film where Cage had not been the composer. This was to be a film, according to Merce's idea, about the workings of the Cunningham Foundation where we lived, but turned out to be about the making of Crowd Spacer, which was the dance that he was working on at that time. And we decided to try a scene where well, every day before the class would come in, the afternoon class, Cunningham would take what he would call his 5 minutes, which was literally 5 minutes, where he would be alone in the room, and he would work at something a piece of choreography, something for next day's class, some movement combination. He would work by himself, and then at some point someone would peek in from the door and ask if it was all right, and then the class would come in and Merce would retreat to his back room. And so I had spoken to him about the possibility of exposing his 5 minutes. The way we agreed to do it was that we would leave a camera in the room, unmanned. We would turn it on. Everyone would leave the room. He would do something. And when I would get the footage back, I would see what that would be. And it hasn't been so many times that I've seen it actually projected large enough to see everything that he did. But I like very much this scene because I can visit it again and again and find something new in it. And when this moment comes in the film, you wouldn't necessarily know that no one is in the room. But if you look carefully, you'll see the camera which is reflected in the mirror, and you'll see that he's in the back corner. Of course, he needs to be far away, far enough away so that it's not completely clear what he's doing. That's the way he was. That's the way he still is. Let's look at this. Okay. The last thing I want to show you, sometimes I would I tried often enough to be lyrical with the work, to find a way to make it accessible without compromising it. Because I've personally found their work sometimes difficult to interpret. And I thought if I did, then possibly others would also. Of course, there's beauty in it and mystery. But I had to translate this work to screen and find a way to make a statement without making a statement, so to speak, in a personal way. And I had come from visually, my background was that of a painter. So I always felt that over the years it was just, I was a painter who was making films, attempting to make films. But it gave me a connection through line, so to speak, in working with the rectangle that started with drawing and painting, which I continue to do today, and I use a lot of drawing in my workshop. When I teach a workshop, people have to draw. But it gave me a connection to the rectangle and following through to cinema or video. That was very powerful and very meaningful. In this last scene, I asked Merce to talk about his day, what he did. And I asked him, what are some of the things that you look at? You spend a lot of time in your studio. What do you look at? He said, well, I look out the window a lot. I look at scenes of snow falling and traffic on the street, or the Hudson River. There are very beautiful views out of the Westbeth studio for those of you who have been there. And even though the subject of Crowdspacer had been the making of the dance, and it was a film for me dedicated to the dancers and their process of what it is to take this impossible movement, oftentimes impossible movement, and make it beautiful, interpret it and make it beautiful. The subtext in the making had been the studio in which everyone works. And the light, Amy mentioned light earlier, the light in this studio as it changes from not just morning to afternoon, but from summer to winter. So the film is, I shot it over the course of a year. It is as much a portrait of the light in the dance studio as it is a portrait of the making of the dance. So let's look at this scene from Crowdspacer and
The day in the studio starts in the morning with classes. There are usually two, one at 10 o'clock and one at 11:30. The 11:30 class is the company class. It's the one I teach when I do teach. But it's aimed primarily at pushing the company, at seeing what I think is possible now to try, again, because it's class, to be sure that they understand it. That's why it's given in exercise form, and where the rhythms are not necessarily as complex as they might be in the dance itself. That lasts an hour and a half, and then there's this rush for food. Everybody eats something, and my lunch seems to be always surrounded by people wanting to ask me questions or decisions I have to make. And in the meantime, I'm working on pita bread with almond butter and hummus and raisins. That's my regular lunch. Comes 5 o'clock, and it's time to quit, because there is a class which has been going on in the small studio for the first half hour. Often the room is loaded with students, and the studio is not large, so that they are waiting to come into the bigger one so they can expand. But I asked for what I call my 5 minutes in between the departure of the company and the entrance of the students. I hang on to the bar. Actually, I both hang on the bar and then get off it. But mostly it's about letting myself have a few moments to move. It's a necessity for my experience.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm sorry we went late, but I felt like it was worth it. I think the shuttles are downstairs waiting. Let's push the screening back to 7:45, and I'm going to suggest that tomorrow at lunch that we do a sort of a community meeting in the parlor over lunch, if anybody's interested. So as a way of spending an hour just talking about what's going on and getting, utilizing that time, I guess, to have some conversations. So if that's of interest to you, let's do that tomorrow.